All right, guys. Our next guest is one of our favorites to chat to. You know him from his excellent work from, of course, Morning Combat alongside BC Brian Campbell on the Draft Kings Network. Here to help preview UFC 303 as well as a couple of other things. The one and only Luke Thomas. One last hurrah for the boys. Welcome back, man. How are you?
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Circumstances being what they are, and yeah, man. At least it's for a good occasion, right? At least it's for a good fight. So, thank you for having me.
That's it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Luke. I was going to say the topology service must be going through their paces with all the cancellations and changes for UFC 303 because we got Connor, Chandler, Khalil, Jamal, Olberg. Now it's Anthony Smith and Roman Dolidze, Alex and Jiri, two in the main event. What do you think of all the madness that's led to the massive switcheroo known as UFC 303, especially with the fact that it's also International Fight Week? It's supposed to be the big one, right?
Yeah, it is supposed to be the big one. I mean, what can you say? Like, part of it is just the madness of MMA and the fact that so much of it is so much matchmaking, so much opportunity, so much change is just injury driven. We've known that for some time. None of this is new, but this is one of those moments where you really get to reflect and be like, wow, Jesus, it's quite stark. At the same time, I think it speaks to the strength of the UFC machine that they can pull together so many different elements so quickly. Obviously, they've got all these guys under contract, but it nevertheless is still not easy to make something out of it. So, I mean, on the one hand, I feel like we should have some managed expectations in the sense that so many of the very best fights on paper were booked so late. At the same time, they're still good fights worth seeing, I think. Everyone wants to see them. There has to be something in the back of your mind about like how diminished they'll be, right? Like everyone was super amped for the second Volk and Islam fight. And then you realize, Volk was really unprepared for this one. He didn't look right. So excited for what the UFC machine can do. Kind of nervous about how it's all going to go, but here we are.
100%, man. And, not for nothing, but Alex Pereira, right? Like, he's like the Newman in Seinfeld. He's the problem solver. He makes problems go away. He stepped in against Jiri in place of John and Stipe. Now he's replaced one of the biggest fights of the year in Connor Chandler. Headlined MSG twice. UFC 300, now International Fight Week. Dude has all the luck. What do you make of him going from, like, just a few years ago, MMA outsider, right? And now a dual weight champion, beloved MMA figure, and also, like, the UFC's go-to guy when it comes to saving cards. Crazy.
I said this on MK yesterday, which is he's kind of like Donald Cerrone, except he more often than not wins the big one, right? I mean, he'll show up against who and against when, and big cards, big stakes, really important for that market, really important for the UFC, really important for that division. He'll show up under less than ideal circumstances, and again, obviously, Izzy flatlined him one time, but short of that, he's been basically, untouchable. Perseverant, I guess is maybe the best way. Certainly it's incredible. So he is the MVP or the whatever description you want to give him of the UFC. He is their go-to guy when they need somebody big, somebody reliable in the sense that he will show up when he says he will, no matter what the circumstances are. And then again, it's not just that he's willing, like, we have seen fighters do this kind of thing, but then we always are like, well, they're action fighters, and it's a coin toss about whether they'll win or not. But then Pereira goes the extra level where it's still uncertain about how it's all going to go for the reasons aforementioned, short notice, the whole 9 yards. But he still wins most of those, nearly all of those, and so that makes him really remarkable, really rare. And he has also obviously been a little bit lucky. Getting into the UFC at the time he did, they knew they wanted to match him up with Izzy. He kind of fast-tracked his way through middleweight, built a reputation. But then since then, every time they've called upon him, he just seems to deliver one way or the other. An incredible, rare feat that you just won't see very often. But we're right in the middle of it, so it's time to enjoy.
It's one of those rare times where the UFC has actually been able to build a fighter in the kind of the perfect way, right? Like, we've seen them get contenders and then they would lose before they get to the title, this and that. But like Alex Pereira, this journey's been perfect for the UFC, and the way it's worked out, having a guy that gets up there last minute. He recently spoke to Oscar Willis at the Mac Life about how he wants to stay active because he doesn't know how much longer he has left, which is understandable. What kind of legacy do you think he has time to carve out before he retires? And also, if like John Jones is number one of all time at 205, Chuck is number two, where do you think Alex can end up?
Is Chuck number 2? I'd have to think about that for a second. I guess he might be. God, I haven't even considered who would be number 2 for so long, because
There's
number 1 was
John
like
Jones and the rest.
Yeah, basically. I mean, maybe Cormier. I'd have to go look at the stats. I mean, the thing with Pereira is this: like, he has such an unusual run that I'm really hesitant to make any declarations about what his legacy will be, because I mean, let's go through it, right? If he wins this weekend and wins spectacularly, I don't think it's likely, but I definitely don't think it's out of the question that he could fight John Jones, right? So there's something that could potentially happen. And, again, we're getting extremely speculative here, but could you imagine what it would mean if he actually did win a bout like that? It would be like hard to comprehend. On the other hand, maybe Jiri this weekend goes in there and flatlines him. It's possible, right? He hits hard. You go back to the first fight, he had some success along the fence line. That's possible too. In which case, that would you would still have this incredible resume, but you'd have to downgrade some of the more crazy expectations or even a sense of what he's done. I would say, again, I'm going to go back to it. It's just so unique because most of the time to get to these positions, as you guys well know and your audience knows too, it takes time to build. But what if you can just stack them all right behind each other without that similar kind of build? What does that say about what you've done in this division versus someone who might have similar levels of like title winning fights or whatever, but has a much longer tenure in this division? Like, it gets back to middleweight. Like, who's a better middleweight, Izzy or Alex? And the answer is Izzy times a billion, because he spent a ton of time there. Obviously, Izzy lost their first MMA fight together and he won the second one. So I guess they're 50-50 in that sense. But you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't have that middleweight resume to be like, oh, he's on par with him or Anderson Silva. It's just, there's just not enough there. So I think what we need to do, and I know it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but he is so unique and this run is so wild, I kind of feel like we need to see exactly where it goes. But if it ends up getting to a place where, for example, let's say he goes to heavyweight and wins the heavyweight title, what would you say then? First triple champ in UFC? And he would do it in probably under 15 fights or whatever. I mean, maybe even much less than that. Like, it's so in defiance of the typical way in which we understand greatness. It honestly would make us review how we understand greatness in order to account for it. It's crazy.
And like, you factor in, obviously, he's running Glory, being a dual weight champion there. And like, for a lot of MMA fans, like, people were aware of Alex Pereira, obviously, because of Israel Adesanya. But like, when he was coming up in the UFC, it just almost, there's another timeline where he was just another guy for Israel to basically beat, and then that would be kind of the peak there. And he's just gone on to achieve such greatness at such heights. And like you mentioned, like, it's not over. He doesn't have the end of the world sort of time. But yeah, geez, if he becomes a triple champion, it's just unfathomable. Or even like a John Jones fight. You're right that he's sort of a special fighter in his own category. Looking at the fight itself, the rematch, I mean, both guys, not really the most amount of preparation, but they both kind of had a feeling they would be fighting each other regardless. I think just a little bit later down the road. Jiri is going to cause chaos, as he always does. We love the Jiri experience, but with that comes obviously a lot of defensive gaps, so to speak. And we saw how crazy the Rakic fight was, even just recently. Do you think he can do enough to avoid getting, clipped and hit by the atomic bomb of Alex Pereira, the left hand?
I mean, you watch the first fight, and if you had never, well, this isn't quite true, but if you watch the first fight, you look at it and you think, okay, he just walks into shit. You know what I mean? Like, he just walks right into it. He had success in two places, Jiri, in the first fight. One was actually really just one place, but in two phases. Up against the fence line was really where he had significant success. That's where he had the best success striking, and that's true in this fight. That's true in the Reyes fight. It's true in several fights. But up against the fence, high pressure. That's what he really does. And then he got the takedown in the first round. Probably won the first round with that takedown, and then the subsequent ground and pound. Although Pereira got to his feet. But the point I want to make here is, if you actually just watch the rest of that bout, he gets cleanly outstruck. Like, if there's any distance between them at all, and Pereira's not like directly up against the fence, he can be close to it, but like directly up against it, he would land. I mean, the leg kicks were brutalizing him. That, I think it was the right hook that actually ended it, not the left. that sat him down in their first fight, where he then went to the elbows to finish him off. So it's like, dude, at range, he's just gonna. I mean, again, we'll see what happens. But in the Rakic fight, to your point, he got lit up there too. So like, it's pretty clear that Alex is a significantly better pure striker than him, and will have a decisive advantage on the feet for as long as that lasts. The question is, how effective will the pressure be this time? How long will he be able to keep it? Will he go for the takedown more regularly? To what extent will he be on the pressure early? In the first round, they were kind of circling each other a little bit more. This time, I think he's going to be much more direct and right to it. So it's like this weird thing. It's like, dude, Rakic was outstriking Jiri until he just wasn't. A lot of guys bomb on him until they just don't anymore. And it feels like Pereira was the first one to kind of, I won't say break that curse, but the first one to really get around it in the UFC in a noteworthy kind of way. I don't think it's accidental, and I think the likelihood of that happening again is probably pretty strong. I just feel like if you got that many defensive lapses, and I know I've seen some training footage where you could see him weaving, bobbing, trying to slip, trying to roll through and then counter again. He's tricky, he's crafty, but it's all behind that pressure that he puts on, and then it gets someone backed up. And then when they get backed up, it's not like the ropes in boxing where you can lean out of the way. You're just so stuck. He has great success there, but Alex now knows that. So you can't rule a guy, dude. You just can't rule Prochazka out. You can't. He's so durable, so tough, so wild. But those defensive lapses, man, they're hard to look past against a guy like this. They really are.
It's kind of hard to imagine Jiri being like, hey, I'm going to go in with a different strategy here because this is what we love about him. This is how he fights. But do you think there's a point where him and his coaches sit down before this fight and they go, all right, strategically, basically going through a lot of the stuff that you mentioned. I mean, they would have seen the gaps as well. We need to be a little bit more careful here. We need to look more for the success that you had with the grappling, for example, or the ground and pound, or the staying out of those situations. Do you think there's any chance that happens, or is that just would not be a Jiri fight, I guess? That was
it's true on some level, but I think what they'll do is they'll probably, if you look, it's kind of gets back to the Johnny Walker thing. Like Jiri and Johnny Walker are very different fighters, but there's something that sort of unites them a little bit. But also, like, now you can see the real big difference, which is Jiri started with this sort of, completely reckless style, and still has a reckless style, but has added pieces to it that are pretty smart. Like, again, like you go back and look at, he was doing a lot of push kicks to the ribs and also to the hip, just to push Pereira back. Like that was very successful for him, not just in getting him back there, but then all the offense that comes from that. And so why do I draw the distinction between he and Walker? Well, Walker has become somebody who was like exciting and reckless, and they've tried to make him very safe. But in the process, they have just made him so much less than what he once was. They've cleaned up some of the defensive lapses, but it's not like he's like a super strong defensive fighter now anyway. He's been put out twice in 2 fights with guys backing him up with boxing. I feel like the coaches with Jiri kind of like, okay, this is who he is. This is how he fights, and there's going to be rewards and risks that come with that. Let's add some pieces to it that complement him, and let's see how far we can take it that way. So I definitely feel like they're going to look at the first fight and they're going to say, okay, we can be a little bit more strategic here. We can be more thoughtful about how we apply this pressure. We got eaten up with leg kicks. I suspect he'll have at least some kind of answer for that, or some kind of thought process about what they want to do about it. And those things could make the difference. That could be by itself, that could be enough to win. But I don't think they should, and I don't think they will look at this and be like, okay, we gotta, you can't just walk into stuff anymore. You can't be, so insanely reckless. Yes, if you had a fighter starting out from scratch, these are things you would want to instill in them. But you've kind of got what you got with Jiri. It's best to build around it while leaving the core of what it is for all of its good parts and its bad parts, leaving that in place.
100%. And I think I think to your points, either way, like given how both of these guys fight, somebody's getting finished, which is what makes this, such an exciting fight while it lasts, essentially. We don't know how, but someone's going down. All right, speaking of going down, just super quickly, guys, call them what you want. I didn't know what I was going to do with the segue here.
Great last transition.
Sometimes
you got to go out on a great last transition.
Sometimes it just presents itself, like me at the park with a trench coat. No, just kidding. Call them what you want to call them, guys. Knee knockers, golden nuggets, thigh slappers, whatever you want. Our good buddies at Manscaped refer to them as the boys. Not every man has children, but every man is responsible for their 2 boys below their waist. When you little guys have more hair than they need. Trust Manscaped for all your grooming dreams. Every man knows how scary it is when going for that close shave below the waist. That's why we trust Manscaped for all our areas. Introducing the Lawnmower family, Lawnmower 3.0 Plus, the 4.0 Pro, and the 5.0 Ultra. 3 ball trimmers. Your fellas downstairs, they need the love, and the ball trimmers give that to you in spades. They're waterproof. They got the skin-safe technology, the LED lights, so you can see exactly what you're doing. Like I said, waterproof, so you can smash that in the shower, move on with your life, and then you can use all the other phenomenal Manscaped products to get yourself smelling A1 downstairs. 20% off with the code submission, and free shipping and deliveries. Isn't that right, Dennis?
That's right, man. Best in the game. Jump on that, get that code, and get your Manscaped today.
All right. With that out of the way, Luke, I was going to ask, man, MVP versus Ian Garry. This is another tantalizing fight that, like, with all the mess of UFC 303, it kind of got a little bit lost in the mix. But it's a huge one for the division. But what do you think was the thought process behind the booking? Just because it's the kind of great fight that, like, you wouldn't really see in boxing when two prospects are on the way up. It's the kind of fight that if they both stayed undefeated, we wouldn't see for 6,000 years, and then it would end up in Saudi Arabia. At the same time, it's kind of odd seeing both of these potential stars for the UFC and both of them relative investments, because of... Hang on 2 seconds. Investments just because of how much they can mean to the division. MVP, you got to assume he's being paid well by the UFC, and he doesn't have a lot of time given his age. A loss here might basically just kill his momentum and end his title dreams. Ian has the age on his side, but again, it's just bizarre. Like, you would think that they're trying to build him up. A loss here is just super risky for either guy. Why do you think we're seeing it?
Partly it's a really weird technical matchup. Right? I mean, you think about it, it's like, how does Ian Garry like to win fights typically? I wouldn't call him a safe fighter, but he does manage risk pretty well and very intentionally. A lot of kickboxing on the outside. I know he had a couple takedowns against Magny, so he can mix it up in different phases, of course, but he kind of likes to keep that range, and not a guy who's big on trading and boxing range, right? That's just not. For example, like, contrast his style with Jack Della Maddalena. Jack Della Maddalena is right in the middle, right in your face, pressure boxing, that kind of thing. That's not what Ian Garry does. He fights very differently. And so you would have thought, okay, well, who could you give him that would be a really interesting test to just gauge exactly how high his ability is? And there's a few different responses you could have gone to. MVP, I don't know, would have been one of them. And then you think about it, you're like, well, that is kind of weird, but it might actually work a little bit. Like, on the one hand, if Garry tries to fight at range in the same kind of way, I don't know how hittable MVP is going to be if he complements that, which is going to make it like a bad fight, but also like one where you could easily lose, right? I mean, the lower the amount of offense that a judge has to evaluate, the harder it becomes for that accuracy to be there. If you look at like bad judging, this is not altogether true. Like, there's obviously a huge number of examples of where there's a lot of offense and the judges still get it wrong, but very, very controversial cases tend to happen when the offense is lowered. So there's that one that's going to be a risk. And so if you think about it, it's like, well, then why would they book this? Well, promotionally, first of all, I don't think it was their first choice. I think they wanted the Colby Covington one, and then he ducked. So there's that. But if you like, when they ultimately got to this one, it's that I think MVP is a little bit different than he used to be, and I think reputationally within the company, it's certainly different than how we have understood him previously. He also used to be a bit of an outfighter that would then dart in, right? Like, these like explosive things where he would just kind of close distance very quickly or elevate very quickly in the case of Cyborg Santos. And there is some risk with there, but he would fight on the outside a lot. And so I think that they might feel like, one, even if he fights that way, that could be kind of interesting, right? Darting into Ian Garry, how does he deal with that pressure? Or I think what you saw in the Kevin Holland fight is he still does a lot of that, but he does it like more often and in closer range now. Like, he has dialed up the intensity and the riskiness of it in a way that he didn't necessarily do exactly before. It's not a huge change, but I think it's a subtle and real one. And that's partly a function of the thing you mentioned, like where he is in his career. He's doing the Michael Chandler bit. He's not here for a long time. He's here for a good time. At least that's what Michael Chandler said at age 34 after beating Benson Henderson and coming over from Bellator to UFC. I think he's in a similar kind of thing. So he's like in a position where he's willing to take on a little bit more risk. He's willing to take on, any kind of name that will get him notoriety. He is fighting, and I think relative to how he's fought in previous times, a little bit more exciting than he once was. And Ian Garry is untested in any number of different ways. MVP is a veteran of the game. So the matchup between them, between an outfighter and a guy who darts in, isn't by itself necessarily going to be all that exciting. But I think the new-ish way, like the dialed up way of intensity that MVP is fighting at, actually could be pretty interesting. And it could be a really great test of the fight IQ of somebody like Ian Garry. What are his problem-solving abilities against a unique and now a less risk-averse kind of fighter, and how MVP is? It could be really interesting results as a consequence. I don't know if that made sense, but to your point, it's so unusual. It doesn't meet traditional guidelines for how we understand how fights are made, but I think the unique combination works.
I love how Michael Chandler said he's not here for a long time, but a good time. And he's been waiting to fight Conor McGregor for, like the lady from the Titanic, just sitting there being like, it's been 83 years, Michael.
Yeah.
I'm not here for a long time. I'm here for a really fucking long time.
And not a good time at all. Anyway, this fight not being in Manchester, UFC 304, was this a big mistake, Luke? I know in hindsight is 2020. Ian wanted to be on the Conor card, but not having this in Manchester seems weird.
The UFC has got so many cards that they're always robbing Peter to pay Paul to make it all work. When Conor was at the top, you had another Irish up-and-comer in Ian Garry also on that card. That made a lot of sense. Now he's gone. You're like, well, shit. If you got MVP, a Brit, who, by the way, has sold well in England when he was on Bellator shows and other ones as well. He was that would have done really well there. There's no question that fight would have done really well there, but I understand the UFC's desire to have Garry on the same card as McGregor. I do think that that's pretty smart, especially since the UFC has really kind of neglected the Irish market of late. I mean, Bellator was just in Dublin for the 50th time or something in the last few years. So I sort of get it. I'm not going to beat him. I mean, all the things you can beat up the UFC for, I'm less inclined to do that.
Yeah. I know Bellator's at Dublin like twice a week, I think, and then 3 times on Sunday at this point. Anyway, hey, we'll let you go in a second, Luke, but I want to talk also about Brian Ortega and Diego Lopes, because it's a juicy fight. I think not ideal because, like you mentioned at the top, like short notice for both guys. But it's an interesting test, and it's a massive, massive gamble for Ortega. He's spoken about, part of his motivation is to put some money back into his church. But at the end of the day, he's facing a young, up-and-coming guy, number 14 ranked Lopes. He's on a tear. He's heavily touted. And Ortega's coming off a nice win against Yair. So, he has a bit of momentum in the division. And, by his own admission, he's not exactly next in line for a title shot. He was considering going up to lightweight. There was discussion of that. But just given the circumstances, do you think this could be potentially a passing of the torch moment between Ortega and Lopes?
Oh, man, this one, 2 cats in a bag. I mean, Jesus, I don't know. I don't even know what could. I mean, the level of the degree to which they're going to be playing speed chess. You guys ever seen Searching for Bobby Fischer? It's a book, but also as well a movie, right? Where they're playing speed chess in the park, where they would move and then they hit the clock, and then the next person moves and hit the clock, and the whole the object is to go as fast as possible. And you can just make mistakes doing that, obviously, right? You have to be able to play a speed game, and both of those guys play that game. They're actually both good at it. And what's interesting is, in the case of not so much against Lopes when he fought Imavov, but most of the time, what they end up doing is they're throwing so much offense at guys. I would say Lopes a little bit more. He throws offense at people both striking and on the ground. Whereas I feel like somebody like Ortega, he does it a little bit more with the ground-based attack, where he's chaining stuff together one after the other. Lopes is a little bit more on the feet as well. But the point I'm trying to make here is, that's usually what they do to lord something over their opponent, where they're throwing so much offense at them that they create blind spots, and then the continuous flow of it ends up catching them in some kind of way. You go to the Sadiq Youssef fight. They're out there exchanging. They get to the clinch. Youssef doesn't keep his hands up for just a brief moment, and Lopes is constantly firing offense, so he catches him, and then that's the whole show, right? This is how they typically beat their other opponents. So how do you beat a guy who, again, there is a big difference in how they stand, but on the ground, they have different kinds of jiu-jitsu, but the same kind of mentality about chaining things together back to back to back like that. Now, I would say, listen, Ortega has shown a much, that doesn't mean he has it, but has shown a much higher level of ability and has beaten much better opposition, generally speaking, I would say. I mean, for example, like Ortega's coming off that Yair win. Lopes has nothing on his resume that's as good as Yair. That doesn't mean he won't. I'm just saying up to this point, he doesn't have that. So you're asking about a passing of the torch thing. Part of me still kind of favors a little bit of Brian Ortega because I do think there is a technical ability difference on the ground. But if Lopes goes in there and does what Lopes typically does, where he just, basically just, runs over people it's more than just spamming them with offense, but it kind of feels like that when you're watching, then there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, you saw Ortega this week saying he wanted to go 155 because there's not a lot of title opportunities. I know you just alluded to this, but it's because he's not really a fresh contender. I mean, maybe he would be for Ilya if they could do something like that, but he's pretty far away. But Lopes would be a very fresh contender. He would be exactly all of those things. So I just can't make a prediction because how the hell am I supposed to know? How the hell are you supposed to look at this and be like, I can say with certainty the fight's going to go this direction? It's not just two guys with some balls out style. It's also on short notice. And so for that reason, it's like, who's going to have a cardio issue? Who's got an injury that they're not disclosing? How much of a risk reward analysis did they take in saying, well, I don't feel great, but they're going to pay me extra to be here. And so it's worth it for me to go under those circumstances. Kind of like Jamal Hill taking on Pereira for UFC 300, coming back from that Achilles injury. I don't know if he was really healed from that, but he was healed enough to do it, plus take the money, right? And so you got something of, maybe a diminished version of him. Pereira still would have won no matter what, but you get what I'm saying. So, dude, fuck if I know. There's my final answer. Fuck if I know. But if he wins, it really reinvigorates the contendership queue at 145.
Dude, I'll tell you, sometimes it's weird with these last minute cards because it creates interesting fights because guys don't have the time to prepare and they don't have the time to really do anything. And sometimes that creates like better fights and other times that creates a bit of a mess. So I wonder what we're going to see. Just quickly, what do you think about the 145 division? We see it's going to be Max and Ilya potentially at UFC 306 at the Sphere. Are you a fan of that matchup? And like just early on, as you're sort of feeling it out, how do you sort of see it going?
So I believe Ariel had reported yesterday U.S. time, that fight was probably going to be in Utah, not at the Sphere. Utah. Yeah. So I went to the Sphere with Brian and for the Grateful Dead show or the Dead & Co. Mm-hmm. And it's not my music. I'd rather eat a bullet. But the Sphere itself, boys, I just can't. I've been going to Vegas since first time I went to Vegas was 1999. It's 2024. I've been going to Vegas on and off for 25 years. I have never once left Vegas and been like, man, I have to go there to see things that I want to see. That's never happened. And I went to the Sphere and I was like, holy shit. Like I would travel to Vegas independent of anything else to go see a show there. And I know that's not really what you're asking. You're asking more about 145. I just want to put that out there. Like whoever ends up going to that UFC show, I don't really know how it's going to look because it's such a unique, weird venue, but you're probably in for something incredibly special. But in terms of 145,
just to your point, when Dennis and I were looking at like what events to cover like internationally, obviously because it costs a lot of money, so you got to pick very carefully what you cover. We were like, man, if the Sphere card is juicy and a good card, that would be cool. Just as like we haven't done that, and it would just be a cool experience. So, yeah, I don't know if that's gonna happen now, but yeah,
it's more than cool. It's hard to understand. Like when you're looking at the screen, right, and wherever you're seated, it goes past your eye line here, and it goes past your eye line when you look up. So like it's behind, like the screen goes well behind you. And so whenever it moves, dude, it's like disorienting. Like there's a couple times I had to grab my chair because I thought I was being like falling over. It's the most insane thing I've ever seen in my life.
Fighters.
Yeah, well, that's the other part too. It's like I don't know how they're gonna react to like this trippy ass shit when they're out there. Like, what does it do to them? What is it? It's just there's so many weird things to it. Like, I really do believe the UFC can do a phenomenal job, but I understand why Dana White spent that much money, and like I get it. Like, that's such a difficult assignment to figure out from a production standpoint.
Everybody wears goggles. All the fighters have goggles.
Yeah, guys. They're going to have to be creative. I mean, to your point. But anyway, getting back to Max and Ilya, it's just dude, that's just one of the very best fights the UFC can make, irrespective of weight class. That's really what that is. It's one of the very, if not the best one, right? If not the best one. I mean, obviously Volk versus Ilya kind of occupied that space for me, and he lost, but what Max did in reinvigorating his career, UFC 300, is just beyond comprehension. You guys all know that as well as I do. And so up against a guy like Topuria, who is, I think, dangerous as shit, and by the fan base not well liked, against Max, who is also dangerous as shit, but adored, it just creates an interesting style fight. It's important for the division. It's important for like high level MMA to watch these two square off. It's going to be an enormous, like, cool atmosphere, no matter Utah or Sphere or any other place. I mean, I'm going to mark that one down on my calendar as like, I don't care what else is going on in my world on that day. That day I'm watching Max and Ilya fight. MMA at its true finest.
In the meantime, one thing to mark down in your calendar is all the phenomenal coverage of Morning Combat leading into UFC 303. Make sure to follow Luke at L Thomas News on Twitter and Luke Thomas News on Instagram. That's where all the spicy OnlyFans links are as well. Subscribe to Morning Combat. Good to see you, boys. Back doing your thing, DraftKings Network. And thank you so much for joining us, man. And also thank you for all the years of coming on. Keep coming on with Dennis. And yeah, it's always meant a lot for you to come on, and happy to be chatting with you, Luke. Thank you so much.
One of my favorite, if not my favorite place to come on and talk MMA outside of my own endeavors, and do whatever happens next. Now, again, I know you're still going to be doing some other work, so I look forward to seeing it. You've done a fucking bang up job, both for media in general, as well as I think MMA media in Australia. And I know whatever decision you're making is the correct one. I'm sure you've thought about it extensively, but thank you for thinking of me and let me be a part of this journey with you guys as well. It's been an honor.
Huge honor. Likewise, man. Thanks so much, Luke.